right. Enough of you have responded to my skipping over the relationship between the alleged relationship between Theodore Adorno and the Beatles. So you heard this when I was reading The Conspiracy by John Wright, and I jumped over it. Now, there's also a mention of this in John Coleman's Conspirators' Hierarchy, the story of the Committee of 300. And, excuse me, I compared both works, and I realized that Wright took what he used, it seems to me, expressly from John Coleman. So let me just skip and go to John Coleman. Now, the whole idea about this is, of course, we're shocked when we hear this. I mean, I remember when they were discussing Coleman in Peter Meyer's email group, and you know, they liked John Coleman's information, but then all of a sudden it got to the Beatles and Adorno. It was like, whoa, what's this? And that's where everybody starts to think, you know, maybe Coleman's wacky. And then we never stop to think, well, maybe he's right. And we've been propagandized to believe that, you know, John and Paul were like the Rodgers and Hammerstein of rock and roll. And not saying that they weren't. I mean, it's, well, anyway, I'll go into some of that stuff later. Not much of it, but just what I recall. So we're going to go to the root of the information, which is Coleman. And this is what he said. He has, under notes and I guess references, he has Introduction to the Sociology of Music by Adorno, Theo. Now, that's a book that Adorno has authored. I'll give you some list of a list of books where you can find more that he's written. But this was Coleman's note. It said Adorno was kicked out of Germany by Hitler because of his cult of Dionysus music experiments. He was moved to England by the Oppenheimers, where the British royal family gave him facilities at Gordonstoun School and their support. It was here that Adorno perfected Beatle music, rock, punk rock, heavy metal rock, and all of the decadent clamor that passes for music today. It is worthy of note that the name, the Beatles, was chosen to show a connection between modern rock, the Isis cult, and the scarab beetle, a religious symbol of ancient Egypt. It did seem that Adorno left Germany in the 30s. That would somewhat dovetail with what Coleman was writing. All right, now this is from John Coleman. Okay, here we go. An outstanding example of social conditioning to accept change, even when it is recognized as unwelcome change by the large population group in the sites of Stanford Research Institute, was the advent of the Beatles. The Beatles were brought to the United States as part of a social experiment which would subject large population groups to brainwashing of which they were not even aware. When Tavistock brought the Beatles to the United States, nobody could have imagined the cultural disaster that was to follow in their wake. The Beatles were an integral part of the Aquarian conspiracy, a living organism which sprang from the changing images of man. And here is a code, URH, in parentheses 489-2150-Policy Research Report number 4/4/74. Policy report prepared by the Stanford Research Institute Center for the Study of Social Policy, Director, Professor Willis Harman. The phenomenon of the Beatles was not a spontaneous rebellion by youth against the old social system. Instead, it was a carefully crafted plot to introduce, by a conspiratorial body which could not be identified, a highly destructive and divisive element into a large population group targeted for change against its will. New words and new phrases, prepared by Tavistock, were introduced to America along with the Beatles, words such as rock, in relation to music sounds, teenager, cool, discovered, and pop music, were a lexicon of disguised code words signifying the acceptance of drugs, and they arrived with and accompanied the Beatles wherever they went, to be discovered by teenagers. Incidentally, the word teenagers was never used until just before the Beatles arrived on the scene, courtesy of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. He's right about the word teenager being invented by they, and the reason why the term was invented, and in parentheses he has divide and conquer. in other words, obviously what I'm taking from this is that he splits away teenagers and they become their own group and they're therefore an identity and they can, of course, be against the establishment, blah, blah, blah. Going on, he's wrong about the time period, though. The concept of the teenager came about during the 1950s, along with phrases such as cool, rock and roll, etc. Bill Haley and Elvis Presley came along long before the Beatles. And that would go back to the whole idea of rock and roll in general, which, of course, was which chagrined most of America. Have you ever seen any of those old film reels from 1950s, the newsreels and such, where you see hellfire and brimstone preachers saying, you know, it's from the devil, etc., etc. Okay. As in the case of gang wars, nothing could or would have been accomplished without the cooperation of the media, especially the electronic media, and, in particular, the scurrilous Ed Sullivan, who had been coached by the conspirators as to the role he was to play. Nobody would have paid much attention to the motley crew from Liverpool and the 12 atonal system of music that was to follow had it not been for an overabundance of press exposure. The 12 atonal system consisted of heavy repetitive sounds taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno, and given a modern flavor by the special friend of the Queen of England, and hence the Committee of 300. Tavistock and its Stanford Research Center created trigger words which then came into general usage around rock music and its fans. Trigger words created a distinct new breakaway, largely young, population group, which was persuaded by social engineering and conditioning to believe that the Beatles were really their favorite group. All trigger words devised in the context of rock music were designed for mass control of the new targeted group, the youth of America. The Beatles did a perfect job, or perhaps it would be more correct to say that Tavistock and Stanford did a perfect job, the Beatles merely reacting like trained robots, with a little help from their friends, codewords for using drugs and making it cool. The Beatles became a highly visible new type, more Tavistock jargon. As such, it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, fads in hairstyles and language usage, which upset the older generation as was intended. This was part of the fragmentation maladaptation process worked out by Willis Harman and his team of social scientists and genetic engineering tinkerers and put into action. The role of the print and electronic media in our society is crucial to the success of brainwashing large population groups. Gang wars ended in Los Angeles in 1966 as the media withdrew its coverage. The same thing will happen with the current wave of gang wars in Los Angeles. Street gangs will wither on the vine once media saturation coverage is toned down, and then completely withdraw. As in 1966, the issue would become burned out. Street gangs will have served their purpose of creating turbulence and insecurity. Exactly the same pattern will be followed in the case of rock music. Deprived of media attention, it will eventually take its place in history. Following the Beatles, who incidentally were put together by the Tavistock Institute, came other made-in-England rock groups who, like the Beatles, had Theo Adorno write their cult lyrics and compose all the music. I hate to use these beautiful words in the context of Beatlemania. It reminds me of how wrongly the word lover is used when referring to the filthy interaction between two homosexuals writhing in pig swill. Oh, okay, John. To call rock music is an insult, likewise the language used in rock lyrics. Tavistock and Stanford Research then embarked on the second phase of the work commissioned by the Committee of 300. This new phase turned up the heat for social change in America. As quickly as the Beatles had appeared on the American scene, so too did the Beat Generation, trigger words designed to separate and fragment society. The media now focused attention on the Beat Generation. Other Tavistock coining words came seemingly out of nowhere. Beatniks, hippies, flower children became part of the vocabulary of America. It became popular to drop out, wear dirty jeans, go about with long, unwashed hair. The Beat Generation cut itself off from the mainstream America. They became just as infamous as the cleaner Beatles before them. And I mean, now that's going to raise a flag with everyone, and rightfully so. The Beat Generation preceded the hippies. The Beat Generation were what we knew as beatniks, and whose head at least was, in theory, Jack Kerouac. Clearly, the Beat Generation came before the hippies. Now, how did the Beatles fit it all into that? Probably bridging both. I never associated them with beatniks or the Beat Generation, and only later did I associate them with what you might call the hippies, because then, yeah, they grow their hair long. The music got to be a little bit more cosmic. So, but let's make it clear, certainly, that the Beat Generation gave over the scepter to the hippies. All right, now, the newly created group and its lifestyle swept millions of young Americans into the cult. American youth underwent a radical revolution without ever being aware of it, while the older generation stood by helplessly, unable to identify the source of the crisis, and thus reacting in a maladaptive manner against its manifestation, which were drugs of all types, marijuana and later lysergic acid, LSD, so conveniently provided for them by the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz, following a discovery by one of its chemists, Albert Hofmann, how to make synthetic ergotamine, a powerful mind-altering drug. The Committee of 300 financed the project through one of their banks, S.C. Warburg, and the drug was carried to America by the philosopher Aldous Huxley. And you ought to take a look at the logo for Sandoz, which is very interesting with this flower. Very schematic drawing, okay, so you can interpret it a number of ways, and I might still have it. I know I gave it to Farm Tech down in Tennessee, who has also slipped me, or actually she might have given it to me. But anyway, it's got this very schematic-looking flower bent over, and from it drops a single droplet into what looks like to me the classic cocktail glass, long-stemmed, kind of V-shaped receptacle. Well, people used to drink, I guess, martinis in. It's okay. Take a look at that. Do a search on that. Very interesting. Yeah, Sandoz is a player, no doubt about it. All right, moving along with what Coleman wrote in the Conspirators' hierarchy. The new wonder drug was promptly distributed in sample-sized packages, handed out free of charge on college campuses across the United States and at rock concerts, which became the leading vehicle for proliferating the use of drugs. The question that cries out for an answer is, what was the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, doing at the time? There's compelling circumstantial evidence that would appear to indicate that the DEA knew what was going on, but was ordered not to take any action. And I don't even know the DEA was, and you can find this easily by just doing a search on this. I don't believe the DEA was around at the time. Not that that wasn't covered by something else. But one of the things I remember in my short, brief stay with the FBI is the story that Hoover wanted his agents to do nothing with drugs, have nothing to do with the drug trade, and therefore created the DEA to handle that. So back in the 60s, I doubt there was a DEA, but certainly this drug was not known to anybody at the time, so I doubt law enforcement could do anything. And you can read about that in Tom Wolfe's the electric Kool-Aid acid test. I mean, this stuff was out there, and the cops didn't know anything about it. What are they going to do? It was not typed as an illegal drug because nobody even knew it existed. So therefore, it was leaked out without a doubt, and yet there was no laws on the books to do anything with it. The drug trade is controlled by the Committee of 300 from the top down. The drug trade started with the British East India Company and was closely followed by the Dutch East India Company. Both were controlled by a council of 300. The list of names of members and stockholders of the BEIC reads something out of Debrett's peerage. BEIC established the China Inland Mission, whose job it was to get the Chinese peasants, or coolies, as they were called, addicted to opium. This created the market for opium, which the BEIC then filled. In much the same way, the Committee of 300 used the Beatles to popularize social drugs with the youth of America and the Hollywood in-crowd. Ed Sullivan was sent to England to become acquainted with the first Tavistock Institute rock group to hit the shores of the United States. Sullivan then returned to the United States to draft a strategy for the electronic media on how to package and sell the group. Without the full cooperation of the electronic media, and Ed Sullivan in particular, the Beatles and their music would have died on the vine. Instead, our national life and the character of the United States was forever changed. I'll say this much, yes, they came with much ballyhoo, never heard of the Beatles, and then there was this hype that they're coming, and they're coming, and they're coming, the British invasion, which now is even funnier to me, and I guess all to you also, knowing what we know now, that this indeed was a soft invasion. But nonetheless, an invasion. And of course, in back of the Beatles, for those of you who might be too young to just get it out at your fingertips. I mean, we had the Hermits, we had the Yardbirds, we had how many were there? Peter and Gordon, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, I think, or at least they did Beatles songs because McCartney and Lennon had written for them as well. The Mercy Monsters. I mean, there was a million of them. I'm forgetting. Of course, the Stones of all things, and And it goes on and on and on. So yeah, they just came one after another, and at any rate, that was the British invasion. Now that we know, it is all too clear how successful the Beatles' campaign to proliferate the use of drugs became. The fact that the Beatles had their music and lyrics written for them by Theodore Adorno was concealed from public view. The prime function to the Beatles was to be discovered by teenagers who were then subjected to a non-stop barrage of Beatle music until they became convinced that they liked the sound and adopted it. Along with all that accompanied it. The Liverpool group performed up to expectations, and with little help from their friends, that is, illegal substances we call drugs, create a whole new class to young Americans in the precise mold ordained by the Tavistock Institute. Tavistock had created a highly visible new type to act as their drug runners. The China Inland Mission Christian missionaries would not have fitted in with the 1960s. New type is social scientist jargon. What it meant was that the Beatles created new social patterns, first and foremost being to normalize and popularize the use of drugs, new tastes in clothes and hairstyles, which really distinguished them from the older generation as was intended by Tavistock. The Beatles started to morph in about 1955, 1966. Pretty much they were like, yeah, I was a kid then. It was like music to hold hands by. It was like, I really like you, be my girlfriend, oh, you broke up with me, and all this stuff. And then they slowly started getting to some more, or their first controversial music. The famous cover photo of, I guess, the album Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, with them in butcher coats, with cleavers and dismembered babies all around. And that later changed to what you see as it is today, with them sitting on, I guess, travel trunks open and stuff like that. And then, of course, they did get into some music that would suggest that there was, it was drug oriented. I mean, when you look at Sgt. Pepper's, that to me is the first one. Although they were going that way in a very steady and logical progression, even before that, with Revolver and stuff, and Rubber Soul before that. So they were going that way, and then, of course, it really did hit big after '67, when they started getting even more in-depth as far as what could be considered somewhat drug-oriented, at least, the music's suggestive of such, until their demise. While a lot of the other groups, if not all of them, just stayed away from that. A lot of them died out because, we consider a lot of that music bubblegum, innocuous, if you will, and they did not necessarily follow the Beatles' lead as far as the groups from England. And even, for the most part, the Stones didn't even get involved with that. I mean, they did, Ruby Tuesday, which was kind of like, Beatlesque in its sense of all the techniques that they use with the music, and somewhat, kind of, Birds, Bells, Incense, Light Show, Woodstock kind of stuff. So the Beatles didn't start out pushing that necessarily, but they did get a lot of kids in the days when they were, wearing crew cuts and loafers and stuff like that, and then brought them to the point where their hair was down to their tailbone, and wearing tie-dyed shirts and ripped jeans. That's my 2 cents. It is important to note that the deliberate fragmentation inducing language used by Tavistock, the teenagers never once dreamed that all the different things they aspired to were a product of older scientists working in think tanks in England and Stanford Research Institute. How mortified they would have been if they had discovered that most of their cool habits and expressions were deliberately created for their use by a group of older social science scientists. The role of the media was, and remains, very important in promoting the use of drugs on a nationwide scale. When coverage of the street warfare gangs was abruptly terminated by the media, they became burned out as a social phenomena. The new age of drugs followed. The media was has always served as a catalyst and has always pushed new causes. And now media attention was focused on drug usage and its supporters. The Beat Generation, yet another phrase fashioned at Tavistock in its determined efforts to bring about social changes in the United States. I'll say one thing about gang warfare at this time so I don't forget it, because I'm not going to remember all this stuff at the end, and that is the major gang warfare took place in the 1950s and was really a problem. And as a kid growing up right across the river in what can still be considered the New Jersey section of the New York metropolitan area, New York was rife with gangs. In fact, one of the most infamous incidents was committed by, I think they could call him the Batman, somebody who kind of like dressed up vampire-like and just slit somebody to death for no good reason. in Hell's Kitchen, which is on the west side of New York. And I believe he's still in prison to this day, an extremely intelligent individual. But here you go. Random violence, senseless violence was the result of the gangs. Nothing really happened in Jersey until probably around 1962, when West Side Story made its run through all the theaters, and all of a sudden, aping what they saw on TV, in my very own town, which really was pretty homogeneic. We had all Anglo, all Catholic for the most part, some Protestants, some Jews, but either Irish or Catholic for the most part, and I didn't fit anywhere because I was a Scandinavian. But the thing was, it was really nothing to fight about. So what happened was, for whatever cause, all of a sudden we had the Sharks and the Jets, and people's loyalties went to both, and some assumed the names. They had to fight for the names, like Riff and Ice Boy and all this stuff. And we had this ridiculous summer of stupid fights and people chasing each other. I should really write a story about that, because playing ball, we were in a schoolyard, which was kind of like a crossroads. And it got to the point where all of us that were playing stickball or whatever it was we wanted to play, when these guys would come through saying, "Did you see the Sharks?" And we'd go, yeah, the Sharks went off that way. And of course they didn't, so the Jets followed them that way. And then the Sharks would come and go, "Do you see the Jets?" And I go, "Yeah, they went that way." And of course it was the other way from, And it was hilarious. It was. One day I gotta talk about that and how it finally came to an end with this unbelievable spectacle of two champions, one from the Jets and the Sharks, bare knuckling it at Lindbergh School Field, and it was hilarious. But anything, gangs came on the scene. I remember reading about them in the New York dailies, and then slowly they just faded away. And probably by the time, they were pretty big in 1958, somewhere around 60 to 62, they faded away, and it wasn't even a thought, And so again, where do these waves of fads come from? Are they foisted upon us? All right, here we go, back to Coleman's work. The descendants of the British East India Company were delighted with the success of their drug-pushing program. Their disciples became adept in the use of lysergic acid, so conveniently made available by patrons of the drug trade like Aldous Huxley, courtesy of the highly respected Sandoz Company of Switzerland and financed by the great Warburg banking dynasty. The new wonder drug was promptly distributed at all rock concerts and on college campuses in free packages. The question that begs to be asked for is, what was the FBI doing while all this was going on? Even though this is a little bit redundant, I have to tell you that this is excerpted from different sections of Coleman's book, so that this wasn't continuous in a sense. It popped up a second time. So when you hear this referred to and you're saying, well, he just wrote that, well, he kind of did, but this comes like 100 pages later. And here he talks about the FBI, which is probably the ones that would have been handling this to a certain degree at that time. I can't remember, obviously, but certainly I do not remember DEA on the scene back in the 60s. I also want to tell you a quick story, if I could. The Renaissance landscaper, whom I refer to often as when I think back to conversations we had and actually stuff we talked about long before, I'm thinking the way I am now. And I don't even know if he's thinking the way I am now, though I think, if I ever contacted him, he might. He was a Rutgers graduate, was in your, the Mensa Group or whatever, he and his brother, who's a lawyer. But anyway, when the Renaissance landscaper, the RL, was down in Rutgers, he and some of his cohorts in science class were trying to develop LSD on a piece of wheat bread. But the problem was, I am not scientific in any rate, but from what he told me, the difference between LSD and killer wheat rust was like, a molecule or something. And anyway, when the time came and they went to visit their piece of wheat bread, whole wheat bread, they knew the time had come, and they were like sitting there sweating, deciding, well, should we take a hit on this, knowing that we might get killed? And they decided, nah, forget it. So they threw their experiment in a wastebasket and never visited it again. Now, we'll never know if they had LSD or killer wheat rust. The purpose of the Beatles had become abundantly clear. The British East India Company's descendants in the upper-class society in London must have felt very good about the billions of dollars that began rolling in. With the coming of rock, which shall henceforth be used as shorthand to describe Adorno's fiendish satanic music, a tremendous increase in the use of social drugs, especially marijuana, was observed. The entire dope business was expanded under the control and direction of the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, run by Leland Bradford, Kenneth Dam, and Ronald Lippert. under whose expert guidance a large number of new scientists were trained to promote future shocks, one of the chief being the dramatic increase in the use of drugs by America's teenagers. SPRU's policy papers, planted in various government agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, dictated the course of the disastrous drug war allegedly waged by the Reagan and Bush administrations. This was the forerunner of how the United States is run today, by one committee and or council after another, by an inner government fed on Tavistock papers, which they firmly believe are their own opinions. These virtual unknowns are making decisions that will forever change our form of government and the quality of life here in the United States. Through crisis adaptation, we have already been changed so much as to barely compare with what we were in the 1950s. Now, again, if that was not satisfying with regard to Adorno, all I can do is add to this, and I'll send you on your way if you're interested in checking this out further. I think what I'm going to impart to you right now is only something that I did on a search myself, but it'll give you an idea, too, of if you want to pursue this further. I will say from what I can see, Adorno was no just average guy. I mean, we're not talking about some innocuous composer. There is a website, a Kentucky EDU website. If you do a search on Adorno's book, Introduction to the Sociology of Music, and I think I got that right. Let me see if that is in fact correct. Yeah, Introduction to the Sociology of Music, Theodore Adorno. And this is what we get from an individual by the name of Larry Nelson, who writes this. Adorno's initial definition of the sociology of music is, quote, knowledge of the relation between music and the socially organized individuals who listen to it. Later he suggests that a finished musical sociology should take its bearings from the social structures that leave their imprint on music and on what we call musical life in the most general sense. He is interested in, among other things, the relation between productive forces and circumstances of production. In the realm of music, productive forces can refer to, and I haven't listed what that is. Now, another paragraph, it says, although Adorno suggests that in the 19th century it was still possible to write decent popular music, he views the production of popular music after the early 20th century as completely dissociated from, and perhaps even antithetical to, serious music. He states that if the concept of decay, which cultural Philistines love to cite against modern work, is justified anywhere, it is in popular music. Although the tone of his writing seems to indicate contempt for those who consume popular music, he states that the people kept out of the cultural establishment, the people kept out of the cultural establishment by economic and psychological pressures were fobbed off with specially prepared stimuli. I mean, that's a pretty heavy paragraph, because when we talk about Adorno possibly being behind the Beatles, he shows contempt for what's going on today, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have promoted it. And maybe, in fact, because he got away with it, he looked at it with some kind of some noxiousness. So, and even in this paragraph, as this Larry Nelson has pointed out, you know, he makes a statement, but then it's kind of like a but statement right after it. This guy is just not a regular guy, which would lead some credence to the fact that he might have been a shaker in whatever kind of psyops were being used to obviously manipulate people like myself in a few years before and after me. So there's something going on there. Now, on another site that is kept up by a Moya K. Mason, and I just emailed her using my stleo.edu email address, which I cleverly keep updated, is because you're going to get, obviously I'm going to get more responses to that, to keith.hansen at stleo.edu, there I've gone and said it, than I will get with Vyzygoth. I mean, obviously. I think that's one of the reasons why I had sometimes a lot better success with getting guests on, because I used stleo.edu. They thought I was a prof, So anyway, so I did email her to ask her if she had any kind of information that chronicled a relationship or a passing, if nothing else, between Adorno, perhaps George Martin, and or the Beatles. We'll see what happens. Okay, so if you go to this website, and I'll tell you what, for both these links, if you want them, I'll send them to you. Or, no, you know what, I'll put them up since I'm doing this on Saturday, you folks will see it no earlier than June 4th, and through that week. You'll see 2 links if you want to go. But if you do your search yourself, you'll come up with this stuff. And I just want to refer to something that she cited from a book called A Dialectical Imagination. And, of course, the word dialectical is not ever lost on any of us. Interesting again. So the Dialectical Imagination by Martin J. And here's the excerpt. Adorno believed autonomous artistic compositions were the pressures of society's utopian possibilities and the last holdout for humanity's desire for a better world, a world which he saw to be immersed in social contradictions. Unless these contradictions were harmonized, music and the other arts must confine to reflect elements of social protest. Adorno also admitted that music itself contained contradictions in its own structure, since it could never be completely autonomous nor fully reflective of culture. What distressed him more was autonomous music being severely threatened by commodification, displaying considerably more features of an exchange value philosophy. He contended that his criticisms of popular music were not based on elitist comparisons with traditionally, quote, serious music, but rather that the real dichotomy was between music that was completely market-driven and music that was not. And if that paragraph doesn't pique your interest, I don't know what will. Consider the fact, folks, that it may very well have been that there was something behind McCartney and Lennon, especially with the Beatles. And before I give you this bibliography, a bunch of books that Adorno has written, I had said this before and I didn't hear it. The only thing I remember growing up, and in Rolling Stone, in fact, and with these reminiscences, they were after the fact, yeah, definitely, by George Martin, who's an excellent speaker, an intelligent guy. And Martin had said that in the first few albums by the Beatles, which would be Introducing the Beatles, Meet the Beatles, and there was another one in there too, and I'm not going to worry about remembering it, you will find really an abundance of covers they did on blues, rock and roll classics. I mean, if you listen to the Beatles' second album, for instance, Roll Over Beethoven, You Really Got a Hold on Me, Chains, Money. This stuff was not original compositions, and Martin told them, hey, get on a stick, you guys are going to have to do your own stuff. So you got to wonder if, in fact, while they first started and being, shall we say, groomed, it was easy for them to do these covers of other songs, in the meantime, perhaps getting up on their feet to become what I believe they actually became in the end. Now, Alan Watt speaks to this, and he said that with Alan being a musician, that these guys couldn't have composed some of the stuff they did at the age they were, unless I guess they were completely, savants or whatever, I don't know. That's out of my league, but there is some indication that they were not very original in the beginning, and that might have lasted for perhaps, 2 years or so. Something was going on, there's no doubt about it. The other thing is, was John Lennon killed for a certain reason? He was murdered, no doubt about it. Some would say, and adamantly so, that it was not, what's his face? Was that Chapman? Yeah, that Chapman was there. But again, you're Patsy, like a Sirhan. And then he was shot by someone else. Now, was he getting ready to talk? Obviously, in 1980, right around that time, late 1980, he died. I guess he was shot in October. I believe it was October. October or November 9th. I remember it was Monday Night Football I was watching, and they broke in and said, John Lennon has just been shot. So that was something. And I was on the phone with somebody from Vermont who had not got it yet on his TV. I'm going, holy mackerel, Everett, you're never going to believe what happened. So anyway, if he was assassinated, why? Why kill him? And also, obviously, there were 3 left. Nobody to this day has ever said anything about their early beginnings. Harrison, was set upon to be murdered. Obviously, it didn't work out, but now he's dead. You've got McCartney and Starr left. I don't know that Ringo would say anything. And McCartney, I do not trust, and I just wonder sometimes about that whole situation. So, obviously, you know that there was a connection between rock and roll and psyops. Alex Constantine did some great stuff on that, which I don't think you can find anymore on the net. I have his email. Apparently, he likes to lay low. When I was talking to Nico Hop, late last year, it seemed that he just wanted to be left alone. Something was going on there. I don't know. But he did a great job about the connection between perhaps the military and the powers that be in rock and roll. And certainly we know that we have been manipulated, which made me think back now, too, to what Kesey was doing, obviously, out at Stanford. I think he was in graduate school at the time, and there's Stanford Research Institute. He goes off with a school bus loaded with acid, and now you got to wonder if Kesey was completely on our side of the street. And it goes on and on and on. So we won't speculate any more about that. But some books by Theodore Adorno. Alan Berg is the title, translated by Julianne Brand and Chris Haley. Cambridge University Press, 1991 release. Introduction to the Sociology of Music, translated by E.B. Ashton, Seabury Press. This is 1976. 1982 publishing date, On the Fetish Character in Music and the Regression of Listening in the Essential Frankfurt School Reader. Edited by Andrew Arado and Ike Gebhardt, The Continuum Publishing Company. 1973, Philosophy of Modern Music, translated by Ann G. Mitchell and Wesley V. Blomster, the Seabury Press. And the last one that was listed under Miss Mason's article was Prisms, translated by Samuel and Sherry Weber, MIT Press. That's interesting. So there you have it. We'll close it right there. Probably raise more questions than it gives answers, and I don't know that we'll ever know. But the thing is, we do know this now, at least I would hope from what I kind of primed the pump with, and that is there is something with Adorno. And maybe I should talk to Alan about that now, having gone into this. So I hope it's been worth your 36 minutes here to listen to, and that'll close it out as far as what John Wright in The Conspiracy and what John Coleman in The Conspirators' Hierarchy have written about regarding the Beatles and Theodore Adorno.